I'm hoping against hope, and that Trump will be far more realistic. There will not be a magic phone call between Trump and Putin. The Russian president isn't somebody to be talked to in that way. He's not going to be talked to in that way. Saying, I want peace, but if you don't do it my way, I'm going to bring in my military. And the military doesn't back down, which means there's no reverse. We're going in, not by Trump. There will be no Trump-dictated peace plan. There will be no frozen conflict. Vladimir Putin has said straight up, Russia will own every square inch. People, the British people, the German people, the French people, that Ukraine can win. And so in order to do this, they just crank out nonstop propaganda. Let's just admit right off the bat that 1,500 to 1,700 Russian casualties a day is the most absurd thing in the world. Even when Russia's hammering the Ukrainians, they don't achieve casualty figures of that level. And the Ukrainians are not hammering the Russians. The Ukrainians are in a defensive crouch. There are times when the Russians, in attacking, suffer casualties. It's war. But, when I talk to Russian commanders or Russian correspondents on the battlefield, they'll say, yeah, the Russians are suffering casualties, but nothing like what the Ukrainians are suffering. Depending on the day, the casualty ratio will be 5 to 1 to 20 to 1. I mean, there's days when the Russians are killing 20 Ukrainians for every dead Russian. On normal days, they're killing 5 for every Russian. But that's the reality. But what they say is the way the war is being fought now, with drones and the control and the close coordination, etc. They say there's days where Russia will not suffer a single death on the battlefield because Russia is in control of the fighting. There's a reason why we don't see the big arrows, because Russia's not in the business of suffering the casualties associated with big arrows. The Russians are doing a very deliberate attack. They take this tree line, they take this building, they take this juncture, they pause, they regroup, they come back in, achieve fire supremacy, bring in the drones, maneuver in, take the next tree line, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, there's some times where the Ukrainians, because they are capable fighters, you'll catch the Russians off guard, and you'll see videos of 3 or 4 destroyed Russian vehicles with 12 dead Russians littering the ground around it. War. But the idea of 1,700, that's pure propaganda designed to influence the mindset of the civilian populations in the nations that are being called upon to provide more assistance to Ukraine. But it has nothing to do with reality. And I would say that the North Korean story seems to be of a similar nature. First of all, what's the legal basis of the North Korean soldiers in Russia? Because the last time I checked, they were talking about these soldiers already being there employed in combat before the strategic pact between Russia and North Korea had been signed and ratified and turned into law. And the one thing I know about Russia and North Korea is they sort of require the I's to be dotted and the T's to be crossed on all their legal documents before they go forward, that they don't get ahead of the game in terms of things like that. So right off the bat, the story of North Korean troops engaged in combat stinks to high heaven. It doesn't make any sense because the legal foundation just isn't there. And then we get into the practicalities of it. There's not a military professional alive that thinks this is a good idea. How do you take North Korean soldiers, 10,000 of them, and integrate them into a Russian organizational structure? They haven't trained together. They don't have any tactical commonality, operational commonality. They don't speak the same language. They don't have the same equipment. They don't have the same communications capabilities. Their understandings of the concepts of war are different. How they use artillery, how they use... It makes no sense. And then finally, there's the whole issue of Kursk. Kursk is religious ground for the Russians. I mean, this is the scene of the greatest tank battle in history between Nazi Germany and Russia. This was the battle that forever tipped the fortune of war during the Second World War. After the Battle of Kursk, the Germans never had the offensive initiative that they were always defending. Their defeat was inevitable. This was the tipping point. And the blood spilled on this soil made this soil sacred. So the idea that Russia is going to turn over responsibility for the recapture of this sacred soil, Russian soil, to North Koreans, none of it makes sense. What is happening, I believe, is that Ukraine is making a desperate bid to get South Korea involved. They want South Korea to provide arms, munitions, and they want South Korea to, provide, political and military support. And South Korea has said they will do that if North Korea gets involved in the fighting. So you see, because when you look at the sources, all the sources about North Korean involvement are Ukrainian. The Ukrainians. I mean, one of the big stories originated from the Center for Countering Disinformation. They're out there, playing the role of, leading investigative journalists. The Center for Countering Disinformation has proved that, the North Koreans are fighting Ukrainians in Kursk. Well, where's your proof? Where's your evidence? I think it's one giant propaganda ploy, again, designed to sow the seeds of confidence in populations that otherwise would be opposed to continuing to throw good money after bad into Ukraine. Ukraine has lost this war. They're not going to be able to reverse this. It's not just the military defeat that's taking place, but winter is upon us. And the colder it gets, the worse off it gets. 90% of Ukraine's thermal production capacity is destroyed irreparably. It's not going to be repaired in time for winter. That means that when the winter comes, there will be no electricity, no running water, nothing for tens of millions of Ukrainian citizens who I believe are going to be compelled into, becoming internally displaced refugees or fleeing the country, creating a refugee crisis in a Europe that's already had it up to here with Ukrainian refugees. They're overwhelmed with, illegal immigrants from North Africa and the Middle East. They have their own financial problems, political problems, and the last thing they need is a new tidal wave of Ukrainian refugees. And the pressure is going to be put on Ukraine to bring this thing to an end. And I think that's the direction we're heading. Trump, when you look at his national security picks, there's a theme that comes out. Peace through strength is his thing, meaning that they want peace, but they've got to be strong. And then when it comes to the military, the military will never back down. And this is a recipe for disaster, because if you approach it peace through strength, that means I'm coming in saying, I want peace, but if you don't do it my way, I'm going to bring in my military, and the military doesn't back down, which means there's no reverse. We're going in. That seems to be an odd stance for a president who says that who ran on a no war platform. So I'm hoping against hope that this is a lot of posturing and posing and bluster, and that Trump will be far more realistic. The fact of the matter is, there will not be a magic phone call between Trump and Putin. Putin won't even take that call. I mean, if Trump thinks he's going to call it, remember the Washington Post ran a story a couple of days ago, based upon good sources inside the Trump administration, that Trump called Putin, and that he laid the law down on Putin. What had to happen, things that had to happen. And I saw that, I went, not only did this conversation not happen, but had Trump tried to talk to Putin like that, the conversation would have been over. The Russian president isn't somebody to be talked to in that way. He's not going to be talked to in that way, not by Trump. I think Trump's smart enough to know that. And so when I saw it, I said, it's a lie. That conversation never took place. And sure enough, the Russian government came out and said that conversation never took place, because it didn't. It was made up. Why? Well, again, to sow confusion, dissent, etc. To bring about distrust amongst within the Russian camp towards Trump, or within Trump towards Russia. People are afraid of the Trump administration actually being able to get along with the Russians. There will be no Trump dictated peace plan, especially along the lines that people are putting out there. There will be no frozen conflict. The concept that you're going to have a Korean War type ending, a demilitarized zone, is absurd in the extreme. Vladimir Putin has said straight up that all of Kherson, all of Zaporizhia, all of Donetsk, and all of Lugansk, and all of Kursk are part of Russia. And Russia will own every square inch. He's also said now that there will be a buffer zone, a demilitarized buffer zone. He's also said recently that territories in Ukraine where there are significant Russian populations will be given the opportunity to hold a referendum to decide if they want to stay in Ukraine or join Russia. We're talking about Odessa, Kharkov, things of that nature. Russia's not backing down from this. Russia's not going to negotiate this away. Russia didn't fight 2.5-year-long war just to give it up to Donald Trump because Donald Trump came in and huffed and puffed and tried to blow the house down. It's not going to happen. Russia's already accepted the fact that the United States is an adversary seeking the strategic defeat of Russia. That's the reality as it exists today. And they're going to treat Donald Trump as an extension of that policy line until Trump proves otherwise. But until then, Russia's ready for existential struggle with the West over Ukraine. That's how important this is. So Russia's not going to negotiate any of this stuff away. What's on the table is a modified version of the Istanbul communique, the agreement that had been finalized in late March, early April of 2022. Boris Johnson in the United States pressured the Ukrainians to walk away from this peace treaty. Putin has said that's on there. There's some stringent things in there. Demilitarization. Ukraine won't be allowed to have a military more than 50,000 strong, and none of it will be NATO equipped or NATO influenced. Denazification. Stepan Bandera and the ideology of Banderism is over. Russia will not allow it to continue. There will be constitutional changes to outlaw this. This is the reality. The fact that nobody in the Trump administration is talking about this reality shows you how ignorant they are about the real situation that's going on here. The best the Trump administration can do is turn off the spigot to Ukraine and starve them of the resources necessary to continue this conflict. Whether they'll do that is another question, because one of the things that Trump has said is that he's going to tell the Ukrainians he's shutting off the spigot, but he's also going to tell the Russians that if they don't accept the Trump dictated peace terms, that spigot can be turned back on. So from the Russian perspective, they just assume the spigot's going to stay on, and they're going to continue to do what they do, which is to strategically defeat Ukraine, NATO, the European Union, and the United States. Well, there's nothing they can do to fortify Ukraine. What they're doing is purely political in nature. They will conflict, debate, and discussion to ensure that they're not blamed for Ukraine's downfall. I think the argument they're going to be making going forward is that the Biden administration was doing everything possible to promote the survival of Ukraine and the eventual victory of Ukraine over Russia, and that it was the Trump administration that's responsible for the defeat, because there will be a defeat. Ukraine will not win. The Trump administration can't turn this thing around. And so this is just the Biden administration posturing politically to ensure that the responsibility for the defeat of Ukraine by Russia goes on the shoulders of Donald Trump. I don't think that charge is going to stick. I think everybody knows who's responsible for this failed policy, and his name is Joe Biden. But that's what's going on here. It's a futile effort. It's a waste of taxpayer money. Again, if I were a voter, they've already voted, but If I were somebody in North Carolina or Tennessee or Georgia where floods came rolling in, $750 bailout check, I'd be furious at the Biden administration throwing good money after bad. It makes no sense whatsoever. Even the Biden administration understands that Ukraine has lost this, and yet they're going to continue to to throw money at Ukraine so that they can say we did everything possible to help Ukraine win, and the blame is with Trump. Yeah, I mean that's a very important point. Every major combatant command that the United States has war plans, and most of those war plans are linked to resources necessary to allow those war plans to be carried out, especially in nations in theaters such as the Pacific, where you have the real possibility of a conflict with China over Taiwan, in Europe, where you have the real possibility of a conflict with Russia, on the ground somewhere in Europe, in the Middle East, where we have a real possibility of a conflict with Iran. The war plans allocate troops, and those troops have certain weapon systems that will be employed in combat for a defined period of time. There will be ammunition expenditure rates built into this plan. And so what happens is you need to have a sufficient stockpile of weapons on hand dedicated to that plan, so that if the balloon goes up and the military starts to cross the line of departure, they have the weapons necessary to initiate and sustain for a finite period of time this conflict. We have given away all of our strategic fat. That is, the weapons that are above and beyond the bare minimum to execute war plans. And remember, we have to be prepared to execute a war plan in all places. It's not like we have a single ammunition dump that we say, all right, well, it's war in Pacific. Shut down Europe, shut down the Middle East, shut down Venezuela. We're going to the Pacific, and all the weapons go over to the Pacific. No, the Pacific has its own weapons. Europe has its own weapons. Middle East has their own weapons, etc. We've gotten to the point now where these stockpiles have been diminished to the point that we may not be able to initiate and sustain combat that along the lines planned in the operational plan, that our American forces will be committed into action and run out of ammunition early on. That leads to the inevitability of their defeat. And so we can't give away any more ammunition. We have to build new ammunition. But we can't dig into our pockets and give it to Ukraine anymore. This is the reality of not just the United States, but all of Europe, all of NATO. NATO lacks ammunition reserves. I had to laugh when Admiral Bauer, the German, said, if Russia didn't have that nuclear weapon issue, we'd have gone in there and kicked them out of Ukraine, we being NATO. And I'm like, really? With what? How are you going to do that? You don't have any ammunition. You don't have any tanks. You don't have any armored fighting vehicles. You don't have anything. And you're talking about going to war with Russia that has a defense industry that now produces everything. We have done so much harm to the national security of the United States. And I guess the good news is, even if the Trump administration wanted to go to war, they're going to have to yield to the professional advice given by the military that will say the same thing over and over. Mr. President, we can't sustain it. We can't go to war until we start building up ammunition reserves. But as we build them up, we have to stop giving them away to Ukraine and to Israel. They're just burning through. Israel's burning through 2,000-pound bombs like they're out of style. Artillery shells, etc. So the good news is that even if Trump wanted to go to war early on, he he doesn't have the capacity to do any large scale ground fighting, whether it's in Asia, West Asia, or or Europe. The bad news is, if he pushes the situation anyways, remember, peace through strength, and the U.S. military doesn't back down. But what happens if you do the peace through strength bluster, and the enemy says, "Screw it, let's see how strong you are." And our military doesn't back down, but we just ran out of ammunition because we burned it all up in Ukraine, and the only thing we have left is nuclear weapons. And because we don't back down, we now have a nuclear conflict at hand. Because one of the scenarios in which America can use nuclear weapons preemptively in a non-nuclear environment is a conventional war scenario where a significant number of American lives are at risk unless we do something to eliminate that risk, the source of that risk, with tactical nuclear weapons. It's the way the war plan is written. So it's a very dangerous situation we're in right now. Anyways, I sort of went off on a little. Again, I do what I do, the foundational framework that we have to put in place here. Trump is pushing for what he calls recess appointments. That is, he wants to rush these guys through. He wants them to be approved so they can start work on day one, etc. He wants the Senate to rubber stamp them. Mitch McConnell, the outgoing Senate Majority Leader, has conspired through parliamentary maneuvering